Good afternoon. I feel like we don't need this. The room's kind of, you could all come very close and we could whisper to each other probably. Here we go. But welcome to this final installment of Obedience and Disobedience. Civil, what are we doing? What's it called? I can't remember. Taking Action on Climate Change. I knew what it's called. My name's Stephen Collis. This is Professor Lynn Cornby, and together we've organized this series to take a look at just that, at this extraordinary moment where climate change is coming into all of our consciousnesses in a much clearer way, and people are realizing that the normal existing avenues for taking political action are perhaps incapable of dealing with this extraordinary circumstance. And people are looking at other means of trying to do something about this problem we're all facing and our future generations are facing. So future generations is where we want to wind up with by having some younger speakers than some of the gray-haired and gray-bearded folks we've been hearing from. I guess they haven't all been gray-haired, have they? But anyway. Yeah, I just want to acknowledge that we are, as we are every time, on unceded Coast Salish territories, and acknowledge the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam, Squamish peoples. Lynn, did you want to add something?
No, you managed to say everything I was thinking of saying. I think we're set. I want to welcome everybody. It's great to see you here. We did toy with the idea at the beginning of the class of having a class motto, jail or fail. And when half the class wasn't here at the beginning, I started to get a bit worried.
That's really all.
Anyway, I think we're set to go. So, Steve, if you want to go ahead and introduce our first speaker.
Yeah, and so it's my pleasure to introduce Brigette DePape. It feels like Brigette doesn't need too much of an introduction. She's perhaps one of the best known activists and political figures in Canada. It feels that way to me, then I wonder. But if you found some older people in Ottawa, no, they know about you too. Take that back. Older people in Ottawa definitely know about Brigette. But like many people, I was deeply moved and inspired when I saw this young woman stand up in the Canadian Senate, I guess is where you were, in 2012, 11. And do one of the most audacious acts and singular acts of protest that we've seen in this country, I think. So what I thought I'd do, rather than blah, 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 blah about Brigette, is read part of a poem in which she makes an appearance. So this is from a book I published a couple years ago called To the Barricades. And it's a poem that's sort of reflecting on contemporary Vancouver, Canadian politics and activism locally here in Vancouver, and 19th century stuff that was going on in Paris. In particular, thinking about some troubling comparisons between Mr. Harper and a fellow named Louis Napoleon Bonaparte, who in 1848 was elected president of France and soon became, emperor, made himself emperor. All right. If this weren't a poem, I would want to talk of protests, of marches in these streets, the force of voices and flags, a group singing loudly, a group carrying what looks like a silk dragon, a group with masks and a makeshift battering ram. I would want to say Paris, say revolution, say Paris and Vancouver touch, known and unknown, but it is not true, and we go on, ignorant of the we have been becoming so long, they say, so long to all that anger and dissent, so long we are government, and you have nothing to do with us, and we've everything to do with you. So long, Paris, hello, Vancouver. Hold on, I say. Have we arrived yet? Have we begun or even returned from having begun once before? Hold on, Brigette DePape on the Senate floor with your sign, Stop Harper, Stop Louis Napoleon. We are coming, or we have been, or we are on our way back from Paris in our barricaded hearts. Please welcome one of the inspiring revolutionaries of our country, Brigette DePape.
Thank you so much for that incredible, inspired poem. And thank you to each of you for being here, for your interest in civil disobedience and taking action on climate change. Big thank you to Stephen and Lynn for organizing this event, for bringing us all together here at this critical moment in our history, and for their leadership that they've shown on Burnaby Mountain. It has been so inspiring to see professors and students coming together to respond to one of the greatest challenges of our time around climate change and the tar sands. Thank you so much for the opportunity to speak alongside Tamo. He has been doing amazing work, solidarity work up north, as well as showed amazing leadership on Burnaby Mountain. So really grateful to be speaking alongside him. As well, see his mom in the audience, and really grateful for the leadership that she showed as well on Burnaby Mountain. It's incredible to see how people have taken these risks for future generations, so thank you. I also want to acknowledge the territories that were on the lands of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh people. And with that, there is a responsibility to tread lightly and to continue their paths of resistance and protection of the land. When I went home for the holidays, I talked to my nephew, Rupert, who's about 4 years old, and he had seen a photograph of a few of us handcuffed on Burnaby Mountain that he saw on my sister's Facebook page. And my sister said, that's your Auntie Brigette. And he said, what is she doing? And why are they taking her away in a paddy wagon with handcuffs? And my sister didn't exactly know how to respond because, she's trying to teach Rupert, right from wrong and these sorts of things. And so it can be kind of confusing to explain, but she simply said, yes, it is backwards. Why is it that the people who are trying to protect the earth are being handcuffed? But that is the state of our democracy. And so she didn't really go into that, but she simply said, they're trying to protect the earth and future generations. And he understood. We are in a context of extreme climate change and climate chaos. And the impacts that are being felt are not just in the future and future generations, but they're very much being felt right now. I think about my mom, who lives in Winnipeg, and she's a gardener, and she loves to plant food and flowers. And it's all the way from my mom in her backyard, where she says, I don't see the monarch butterflies. They're not coming to the garden anymore. We are in the warmest on record year. 2014 is the warmest year, was the warmest year on record. And that's really troubling, and it can feel really overwhelming. We see the impacts all the way from, my mom's backyard to Fort McMurray, the tar sands. I think of friends whose fish is being poisoned. Many people were at the Healing Walk, where we saw people who have been fishing for years, for time immemorial, and hunting and gathering indigenous communities like Fort Chipewyan. And meanwhile, we see the entire boreal forest is being destroyed because of tar sands. People can no longer fish, can no longer pick berries. Their ways of life are being destroyed because of tar sands. And so, meanwhile, that's causing climate change on the other end of the globe. In many corners of the earth, we're seeing climate chaos, climate destruction, all the way from the Arctic to places like the Philippines, where people are losing their homes, like with the most recent typhoon. People are losing their children. It's a very sobering reality, and there is a real sense of loss there, of feeling what is already being lost. That is why I am so grateful that you're all here today. to come together to figure out how do we respond to this crisis together collectively, this challenge of our time, to shift paths, because there is another way. There is definitely another way. And when we think about democracy, as was mentioned earlier, we see a failing democracy, where we see a capitalist system that is based on the exploitation of people, and we see how that system is failing us in so many ways. And we see how that particular system and how it relates to our democracy is one in which it is profiting the interests of specific elites rather than the rest of us and global humanity. And we see how profit has been put first, and short-term election cycles. And at that rate, how can we possibly avert this crisis? And given this context, it will take nonviolent direct action and civil disobedience in order to really take matters back into our own hands. Who here was part of the demonstrations during Burnaby Mountain? Who attended a protest? Amazing. We're in the right place. This is a conscious and mobilized place. It's kind of a dream come true, to be honest, coming from Ottawa, where there was certainly a consciousness about climate change, but I couldn't have even dreamed of this kind of coming together of professors and students and parents mobilizing together who are conscious, but not only that, because actions speak louder than words, who are also taking action. And so one of the questions that was raised through this panel discussion is, at what point do we have the right to violate the law? And so I think of historically, there have been incredible movements. I think of my big sister Noelle, who's been such an amazing influence on me. And when a lot of sisters were giving their younger siblings magazines like Cosmo or these sorts of things, my sister gave me a book on Harriet Tubman, and this amazing woman who violated laws in order for her liberation from slavery. And we saw amazing people coming together who violated laws. There's a law in the 1850s that essentially forced people to tell on when they saw that slaves were being housed in people's homes in the Underground Railroad. And many people also violated that law in solidarity with people together for their collective liberation. There's a long history of this. There's a long history of that here, like the Haida Nation, learning about how for so many years there have been violations of Indigenous rights and Indigenous livelihoods, and yet so inspired by the history of the Haida people who, when there was logging that was proposed on their territory and they didn't want this to happen, they blockaded and they successfully stopped logging from happening on their territory. You saw grandmothers with their sons and daughters and nieces and nephews. How inspiring to see. So there is a long tradition of civil disobedience that we can draw inspiration from as we face challenges of our time today. And when I think about this call to be civilly disobedient, with respect to the tar sands. To be honest, when I was first asked to do this, it was a call from Tom Goldtooth, from the Indigenous Environmental Network, from Naomi Klein, Maud Barlow, a few others, who called upon people to go to Washington to protest against the Keystone XL pipeline. And a group of us went from Ottawa. We took a road trip down to the White House to see what was going on. We were called to act, but at that point, I had just lost my job and was not in a good place, not in a very stable place. And I was, afraid. And so at that point, I didn't do it. But I did see mentors who boldly took action. people from the Indigenous Environmental Network like Thomas Goldtooth, people like Naomi Klein and Maud Barlow, and many, many students and young people who did this, and their parents and their grandparents. And it was incredibly inspiring. And from that, went to the Healing Walk, as many people here did as well, and met people who were directly impacted by tar sands. And also met people here when I came to Burnaby specifically, in SFU, met people from Broke who had been organizing a rally, met people who had organized, students who had organized a rally right here on this campus, who were concerned about climate change, violations of Indigenous rights. And it was incredibly inspiring to see that. So then Kinder Morgan decides to, file this injunction against the people who had been peacefully protesting on the Hill. And we'd gone to meet the caretakers at that point, who were so courageous and brave and had gone and were taking care of the mountain. They were some of the first people, and a lot of those were young people. And there is an incredible role that young people have played throughout history in leading many struggles. Like we see in the civil rights movement, for example, some of the students who were challenging racism, they were sitting there at lunch counters, and they challenged the institutionalized racism, which said, whites can sit here and blacks cannot. And they said, no, that's completely unacceptable and wrong, and they challenged that. And we are seeing, many young people stepping up as caretakers of the mountain. When Kinder Morgan decided to really use these underhanded tactics of this slap suit for people who were bravely standing up, like Adam and Mia, like Stephen and Lynn, it was really frustrating and discouraging because they just have so much money. But what was so incredible was seeing the day, that Monday, when they were scheduled to go and follow their injunction orders, that Monday. And it was amazing because you saw people, students, professors, parents, grandparents, come together on that hill that day. There was about 1,000 people who effectively stopped them from carrying out their court injunction. Millions of dollars behind this, and yet what we had was people power. We had strong and we had courageous hearts who came to the mountain that day and said, no, you will not get away with this. And that is people power. We saw that continue throughout the week as they continued to try. My roommate, Miriam, who's amazing, grassroots organizer, she said, I think maybe we should take a shift on the mountain and sleep overnight. And I remember I had a soccer game that night, and I was like, I don't know if that's really, I've got a soccer game. So we decided to go after the soccer game, and we slept on the mountain. And just for one night, meanwhile, some people had been staying there for months in order to protect that mountain. And that next morning, that's when Kinder Morgan came, and it was really disheartening because there was people who lied, who said that they weren't going to be coming. But they came that morning in these black cars, and we saw how they were undercover. It was not the usual police car, and it was really troubling. There was a few of us there that morning, and we blockaded. And that morning I had been really afraid that might happen. I remember getting a video from my friend Arnie that morning, and it was a video from elders who were sending solidarity to people on Burnaby Mountain who had been part of the Haida blockades on Lyle Island, sending solidarity, and they sent a song. And it was the Women's Warrior Song. And it was so inspiring to hear that song that morning. And there were some people who had been caretakers, and that morning we linked arms. And it was scary, but it was also empowering, and it felt right. After that, it was so inspiring to see people who were coming to the mountain throughout that week. Many people risked arrest, and at that moment, that the initial blockade, we didn't stop them from the coming and enforcing the injunction and drilling. And so I also think that there's a lesson to be learned there that, this could very well happen again. And how can we make sure collectively that when that happens again, that we will be prepared, we will have the numbers, we will have enough people who are ready, who feel trained, who feel prepared to be able to do this. Also recognize that there was a lot of racism that happened on that hill, and I think that just speaks to the problems more systemically within our society. As a white woman, for example, was given a blanket from the officers and treated in a very different way than, say, my friend Mel, who's an Indigenous man, who was literally shoved up against a cop car. Tamo will share his experience, or may share his experience there. And seeing friends who were just shoved up against the ground, it was really devastating and heartbreaking. It was unacceptable to see that. And it was also a lesson from that. And I think it's really important that when engaging in civil disobedience, to recognize that the risks and the rewards are very different for very different people, depending on your place in society, and that people have very different realities. For example, migrants, there's risks around status. We see for low-income people, they're more likely to be treated in a way that is inhumane when they're in the jail system. So I really admire the people who took that to heart, those realities to heart, and organized in a responsible way, like the legal team who made sure that there were systems in place to be tracking people, to be tracking the names of people who were arrested, to make sure that they were accounted for and that everyone had jail support and jail solidarity. It's incredibly important work. And when we think about, whether or not the civil disobedience is a right or responsibility, I do believe it's a responsibility for our collective humanity to do this, including for future generations. I was grateful to have an Indigenous relations course when I was at the University of Ottawa, and that's one thing that my teacher Marcelo told us about, was thinking about the next 7th generation. And in that way, we do have a collective responsibility, not only to care for one another now and in our organizing as well, and for justice, but as well to the next 7 generations. It's really inspiring in a place like Bolivia, where they actually have a committee that is tasked with thinking about the next 7th generation. How can we embody that in our organizing? There is a role for everybody. And so for some people, that may be the front line, that may be risking arrest, but that may not be the role that everyone feels comfortable in. There are so many different ways to support, as many of you probably saw on the mountain. It can be bringing food to the caretakers. It can be jail solidarity, going to meet people after they get arrested. It can be organizing events, writing letters to the editor, press releases and articles. They're fundraising. There really is a place for everyone in our collective responsibility. And it's really amazing to see people who are really stepping into their power to make this a reality. How am I doing for time? Okay, sorry. Okay. When we think about how do we justify civil disobedience and to strengthen, not undermine, our democracy. In this instance, we can look at history, we can look at critical movements for liberation and for rights of all people, from Harriet Tubman to the Haida, as was mentioned before. When we think about a definition of democracy, that is really focused on people deciding their own fate. And it's about the people governing the decisions that affect their lives. That, in essence, is what democracy is about. And so when we see that politicians, or the corporate elite more specifically, are not necessarily representing the interests of the people, like we saw with the Tsleil-Waututh, they're against this pipeline. Like we saw with the city of Burnaby, the people are against this pipeline. And yet to see these corporate interests going ahead anyway, it is at that point when we can say this is going against the interests of the people, and we must act in their interests. In that way, it is one of the most living forms of democracy out there. It is living, breathing democracy in action, and it's incredible, and it is an incredibly important part of a functioning democracy. What are the stakes if we do not act? If we do not act, we will feel unprepared given the climate crisis. We will feel anxious about what is happening around the world, all the way to in our backyards. About spills. We just today heard about a spill in English Bay. And we know that those are very real risks with these pipelines. And the stakes are huge in that way. At the same time, if we do act, that is a much more hopeful future for us. You know, we can feel prepared when it comes to seeing that the tar sands are not expanded in the same way. We can ensure that greenhouse gas emissions are decreasing. We can feel hopeful. We can feel a sense of community and solidarity when we come together with Tsleil-Waututh, with people in Burnaby, with brothers and sisters, our parents and our elders and teachers. And we can feel care for one another and care for the environment that we are so grateful to have give us life and life for the future generations. We face an imminent challenge as well, not only the Kinder Morgan pipeline, the National Energy Board hearings. We know that things could heat up again in September and October, and each of us may face that choice, that very real choice of will we act and will we decide to take action? And it's really inspiring to meet people who are already taking action and who know that this is really an important time to step up. We are also at the time of an election, and we know that the Harper government could very well be re-elected with a majority government. That is a very real possibility. At the same time, there is a very real possibility that we veer in a different direction, and that is one where we see a government that better reflects our values around care and compassion, around protection of the environment. And this really is a critical time, and it's important that we feel prepared for that. We have an event coming up on May the 1st, I believe it is. Yes, I think that's it. But I will get back to you all, and if I can maybe access the emails of folks. There's a democracy town hall that is happening, and it essentially be to come together to get prepared for the next election, to be able to get ready to mobilize. The Council of Canadians also organizes on pipelines and is doing some support and solidarity work on the Burnaby Mountain Pipeline. I've got a sign-up sheet which I can pass along, and if you're interested in getting email updates, please sign. As well, if you're interested in volunteering, either with our Getting Out the Vote campaign, if you just want to put 1 star beside your name, if you're interested in volunteering with Get Out the Vote, and if you're interested in volunteering around pipelines, Burnaby Mountain, that sort of solidarity work, then if you want to put 2 stars beside your name. Does that work? Okay, awesome. Thank you so much for your time, for your care in this critical issue, and I feel so grateful to be with you here, to be confronting some of the greatest challenges of our time. So thank you.
Thank you so much. That was truly inspiring. That was fabulous, Brigitte. Thank you so much. We're going to ask you to save questions. I'm sure we can pull lots of more cool stories and ideas, but we're going to save those until after we hear from our second speaker. And it is my honor and my pleasure to introduce today Tamo. You can sit for a minute. I'm going to say a couple things about you. I got a sneak peek, and I know you're going to get to see some footage of Tamo on his board. He's been a snowboarder since he was 11, and I understand since you were 13, you were going back and forth between the Andes, and he was, lots of people here like to spend their summers, back and forth. Tamo is always chasing winter, or was, and a few years ago, really, the humanitarian instinct, I guess, kicked in around the same time as the environmental instinct. And Tamo founded what became eventually Beyond Borders. I had the pleasure a couple of years ago of seeing I think it was your first film on Berlin. Well, you probably made more before that, but the first one that I saw about his adventures in Peru. And one of the things that has stuck with me since seeing that was Tamo commenting on how struck he was by the children that were begging when he realized that what they were begging for was a sip of clean water. And I think that sounded to me in watching that film was a life-changing moment for Tamo. And I think of it today, thinking about what's happening in California with the drought and how climate change is impacting our water, and then the water theme with the oil spill today. Beyond boarding, I'm probably going to leave the veggie bus and all that. I'm guessing you're going to talk about some of that. Okay, I'm going to let you come up here because you got lots to say.
Thanks for that intro, Lynn.
No, sorry. There's one more important thing I need to say. Starfish last year named Tamo. So Steve and I were because we had invited Tamo, I think in maybe January last year, and then in May he was awarded #1 spot on the top Canadian environmentalists under 25. So I couldn't forget to mention that.
Are you calling me a starfish? Thanks, Lynn, Stephen, and all the organizers. I know it takes a lot of work organizing something like this, and I think you're truly an inspiration for educators in this time that we live in. To bring these type of topics into a class is really important, and I highly respect that. And I want to acknowledge that we're gathering on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, the Tsleil-Waututh, and the Squamish, and I think it says something that despite living through years of genocidal and assimilation policies at the hands of the Canadian government, that now today they're actually leading us in the fight against climate change, whether that's in the courts or on the front lines, to the 3 biggest fossil fuel projects on the Salish Sea, wood fiber LNG, Vancouver's coal expansion, and Kinder Morgan's tar sand pipeline. And I think in the following years that come, we'll have great opportunities to follow their lead from these 3 nations that have cared for the Salish Sea for thousands of years before we arrived. So thank you again for coming out. It's pretty cool speaking with Brigette. She's a pretty badass activist, and I'm pretty stoked. I'm really excited to talk about the subject of civil disobedience and climate change. The best way I think I can talk about these subjects is through my own experience and my story, because in reality, I have no academic experience or expertise in these issues, and in being completely honest with you, I'm a 24-year-old university dropout, sponsored snowboard bum, which I think there's a bit of humor in that, presenting at a President's Colloquium at SFU. I don't know. So now you're probably wondering, how in the world did a 24-year-old snowboard bum that lives in a waste veggie oil vehicle most of the year become involved with environmental activism? The answer, I think, is an exciting one, because it shows that just about everyone can jump into this movement, and that's that a couple years ago I wasn't involved whatsoever. Like most of my friends, I could tell you exactly what the surf forecast was doing on the island, but if you asked me something political, I would probably run away. Yet, we all have experiences that change us. And in my travels down to South America for snowboarding, I'd been bothered by the inequality and poverty witnessed on my trips down there. And a couple snowboard friends started an organization called Be On Boarding, basically a collective that was set on bringing social issues into the snowboard community. And so we created our first documentary, the one that Lynn talked about, showcasing a local nonprofit's food security work in the tributaries of the Amazon, a community, one of the largest cities in the world, only accessible by boat or plane, Iquitos. And we worked in the slum community of Belen. And it had this way of waking us up that month down there to the human impacts of climate change and how it's already affecting people. Because melting snow in the disappearing Andes was making life in the area almost impossible as floods rose into these people's houses 10 meters plus. Imagine flooding of open pit sewage rising into the homes for 6 months a year, into the homes of families and an organization trying to build community, yet being displaced by a problem that they had very little contributions to. And so in a way, you come back from a trip like that to Canada with a very different perspective on what does climate change mean. And for me, climate change was no longer this media debate of how many gigatons of carbon we can release to prevent this percentage of warming. Instead, it becomes a race against time to fight for communities that won't exist if we continue down this same path. And so suddenly, my snowboarder, or I guess you could say ears, began to critically ask, what is our role in this destruction? And so you learn about Canada pulling out of the Kyoto Accord that was binding us to emission reduction. And you hear about our government's current policies of extracting basically as much fossil fuels out of the ground as fast as possible with 13 proposed oil and gas pipelines to our coast. And so, like snowboarders in Be On Boarding fashion, 2 years ago, we embarked on an 18,000-kilometer documentary road trip across this province. 3 long-haired snowboard bums all the way to the Alberta tar sands in a school bus running on waste cooking oil. Not your average snowboard trip. We wanted to learn firsthand how these communities at the extraction sites felt, as well as spread our messages to new audiences, to snowboarders, to high schools, and to community centers. You guys want to check out the trailer for this film? It's coming out on Earth Day.
We kept hearing about these different pipelines and projects like fracking, and we really wanted to learn more from the actual source, so we decided to follow the route around BC and see how communities were actually feeling.
You can look it up and say that it's not happening or it hasn't gone through yet. It's already going through. It's already happening.
There was quite a major spill about a mile from our farm. An awful lot of it goes underreported and a lot of it goes unreported completely.
We are living off the grid.
Solar energy is the way to go.
There's so many good projects that are happening, primarily at a grassroots level, that are starting to get really huge.
It takes 3 barrels of water to take 1 barrel of bitumen out. This is not clean oil anymore.
We don't know the true value of water, and that's what future generations will find out.
Working in the industry, the thing that really got me the most was kind of this awareness of something big was happening to the environment.
There will be no development going on in the circuit headwaters area.
You're preventing them from using their drill. And that is a mischief under the criminal code.
My ancestors died for this place. I'm willing to put up my life for it. Like a condemned man, if you have to rule, use an open hand. If you have to die, kill the desires that you have.
think a round of applause also should go to Mitch Stuckey, who helped us edit that video. So what we soon discovered is that although we're not very much not on the front lines of climate change's brunt destruction, like a place like Belen, like we visited, or devastated areas from typhoons in the Philippines, here in BC, we are very much at the forefront of the fight about how much fossil fuels we're willing to burn as a species. And you know what? This coast is almost like a fault line right now for the expansion of the fossil fuel industry backed by government at both levels, provincially and federally. Whether it's the expansion of the thermal coal export port, one of the biggest proposed in North America in Vancouver, a ginormous LNG export industry fueled by fracking from northeastern BC, and the opening of tar sands to Asian markets through pipelines with proposals to Vancouver and Kitimat, it's clear that our actions or inactions will play a key role in our climate's future. And you know, when you set out on a trip like this, we expected to see the environmental damages of projects like that, and they were in no short supply. As we toured through northeastern BC, we were told stories of tumors and moose and fish in indigenous hunting grounds near frack sites, or while we stood alongside tailing ponds the size of lakes in the Alberta tar sands. Yet, in all honesty, it wasn't the environmental impacts or the issues that hit hard, but rather it was the social implications of what was happening in these northern communities that hit me the hardest. At our high school presentations in northeastern BC, where frack gas is extracted, it really did feel like we learned more from the kids than we could teach. We were overwhelmed by the kids. The amount of kids dropping out of high school before grade 10, already making more money than their teachers. You can imagine what that does to a community with kids that age, no inspiration for education, and that kind of money. In Kitimat, where both oil and gas pipeline terminals are beginning construction, drugs and crime is going through the roof. As an ironworker friend of mine who grew up in Kitimat explains, any drug of the week you can find any time of the day, it's almost easier than ordering a pizza in this town, and it never used to be like that. You know, and our own experiences were backed up by the Peace Report, a recently released government study of Fort St. John and Chetwynd, which examined violence against women and girls and found that the high level of violence, wealth disparity, substance abuse within these communities was the direct result of isolation, materialism, and camp life. And it goes on, and this is really important, it goes on to explain that these three factors are inevitably woven into the boom of oil and gas development in the area. Not surprisingly, this document was released on a long weekend a couple of months ago and hasn't been covered by any media down south. So while the argument of jobs versus the environment, or the economy versus the environment, seem to always circle around these projects' merits, are the social problems at large being forgotten? You know, these fossil fuel projects, you know, be it pipelines, LNG facilities, they shine themselves as the epitome of progress, of safety, of development. Yet progress and development is not an uninterrupted line taking us to somewhere better. There's always a cost. And it makes me wonder, what is the true cost of 13 proposed oil and gas pipelines to this province? What type of province are we creating morally? You know, we look back at our ancestors and we condemn them. We say, how could they commit such atrocities with slavery when a more just world was possible? Yet I have no doubt that they will look back on us, our kids, if we don't act now, and condemn us for lacking the courage to stand up and the infinite excuses we came up with to avoid challenging the status quo and protecting the environment that we are utterly dependent on. You know, in retrospect, injustice seems so easily recognizable. Social struggles of the past are almost summed up like a Hollywood movie. You have your good side, you have your bad side, and you know, the path is so straightforward. Obviously, we should allow women to vote, indigenous people to vote, end apartheid, end slavery, and of course, we totally overreacted when we threw Japanese Canadians in internment camps during the war. Yet at the time of those struggles, it was not so easy to see. The most disgraceful periods in human history were arrived at slowly, with an infinite number of decisions made by real, everyday people. We don't go to bed one night in a province with a healthy democracy and vast thriving ecosystems and wake up in the morning with a corporate government and an environment that no longer supports us. There is no tipping points, but rather many moments for us to make a choice. And for us, we started this trip. We believe we could make a difference through getting youth to recycle, compost, write letters to local officials. Although after you go on a trip like this, after learning the scope of the problem and seeing our government so in bed with industry, it's hard to see changing light bulbs and using reusable water bottles as the type of change we actually need. Sorry. My first introduction to activists on the ground that made me reassess how change can come about was in our time in the sacred headwaters. This vast wilderness is located in the northwest quadrant of British Columbia. It's a place where wilderness still outnumbers people and is home to 3 of the largest undammed salmon-bearing rivers in North America, the Skeena, the Stikine, and the Nass. And it's also home to the unceded, unsurrendered Talta and First Nations. And like most First Nations communities, there's a high rate of suicide, drugs, alcohol, and unemployment, a direct result of the dispossession of their lands and Canadian colonization, a community that more than any other needs economic stability. Yet it is also the location where a select group of Klebonatine elders and activists called the Klebona Keepers are drawing a line in the sand and saying no to industrial development and projects that put their water, land, animals, and grandchildren's lives at risk. It's this iconic place where for the first time I saw people sacrifice their own well-being for their responsibilities to land. And within days of spending time within the community, we were invited up to join them at their hunting camp at a blockade in the heart of the sacred headwaters in an area known as Klebana or Klepan. The site, which is their hunting camp, is also where a foreign company has plans to put a 160 square kilometer open pit coal mine. For weeks we served eviction notices to the company. We drummed at the camp. We met with government and the CEO of the company. We started online petitions that went viral. We garnered nationwide attention, yet nothing changed. Nothing changed, and the company refused to leave because of its legal liabilities to its shareholders to make money. Following that, the provincial RCMP was brought in to an area over 600 kilometers from the nearest police detachment. They brought in a police helicopter, plane, 8 ATVs, 4 SUVs, 6 wall tents, as you can see behind, to a peaceful protest of sometimes no more than 10 of us, elders and kids included. The line from one of the police officers will stick with me forever. We're here to protect the peace. You have the right to protest, but you cannot do anything that affects them from using their permits. Their permits, referring to the permits of an open pit coal mine, not the traditional hunting rights of the local community, nor the salmon fisheries downstream. Their permits, More bluntly, you're allowed to protest, but if your protest works and stops the destruction of this mountain, then it becomes illegal. So after 4 weeks of drumming down at the camp, the government wouldn't uplift the permits. The company continued to work, and as used in almost every successful social movement, we took action. We occupied 2 of their drills for 2 weeks, preventing them from working at their drills. And the company, needing to showcase to their shareholders that they were still moving forward, began flying over these drills to new sites. And so we ended up occupying their main mining camp, not letting them fly out of the camp. The RCMP, other than lie about mischief charges, did nothing to stop us. Perhaps it was the timing of our actions, where we timed it up with Reconciliation Week in Vancouver. And as Rhoda Kwok, the spokesperson for the Klebona Keepers, put in our press release, they apologize now down south for residential schools when they took the kids away from the land, yet as they apologize, they're taking the land away from the kids. And you know what? The company was forced to pull out before they were finished their drilling this summer. We also costed the company so much money they didn't return this past summer. Now, This is a victory in the sense they're no longer contaminating a fish-bearing stream in the sacred headwaters, but it's a bigger victory in the sense of what the possibilities are for a small group of individuals to create change. This was a community of all ages, elders, kids, snowboarders, all taking part in a direct action that worked compared to the avenues that those in power asked us to follow. The direct action wasn't the first by this group either. In 2004, months of roadblocking and sacrifice by the local community paved way for kicking out Royal Dutch Shell from fracking the sacred headwaters. Uh-oh. There we go. Although I cannot gloss over this story or romanticize it, as easy it is to do, there are no rewards for the work they did. These were families at the poverty line, sacrificing jobs, coming home in debt, to spend 6 weeks up Clapan to save an area that should be sacred to us all. We often hear chatter, especially in the environmental movement, that First Nations, treaties, no treaties, is the last line of defense for protecting the environment. Yet after my time in the sacred headwaters, my mind races to the thought, if our views come from seeing change from the most marginalized, systemically impoverished communities on the planet to be BC's wilderness savior, the question begs, what the hell are we doing for them? And when you have an experience like the one we had up in there, our small group of snowboarders decided that our energy would be put towards solidarity work with the Klabana Keepers through fundraising, media, and on-the-grounds resistance with this group. And at the same time that we are realizing that actions on civil disobedience is not only empowering, but allows for a shift in the way we tackle climate change. That closed-door meetings, government meetings, failed UN summits, lobby groups haven't been successful. They've been debating since I was born. Actions give us another avenue. They give back power to local communities. And so we began to organize rallies and actions throughout the last years. And one of the most memorable ones that I've had was staging a die-in at the Trans-Canada Open House in Hazelton, which resulted in Trans-Canada canceling their next open house in Hazelton. But not only that, it opened the door for communication between the group that's fighting Trans-Canada up in Hazelton and those fighting Trans-Canada down at Keystone XL. Other memorable actions was 2 months this summer on 2 different blockades with the Klabana Keepers, one alongside the Wildlife Defense League, where we were fighting overhunting in the sacred headwaters, and the other against Imperial Metals, the company responsible for Mount Poly. There's a moment I'll never forget. You can imagine hanging out with the vegan crew of the Wildlife Defense League, and them cooking alongside moose ribs this big by the Klabana Keepers. But I think that epitomizes our ability to work alongside each other's struggles through civil disobedience. And that's something I really want to touch on later on in this talk. Yet actions we've been involved in not only take place in these remote communities, but also happen as close as Burnaby. Last fall, for those that have been watching, over 100 people were arrested, including myself and Brigette, and maybe actually other people as well in this room. And it was an opportunity for urban areas to get involved. And in the large media explosion that happened with Burnaby Mountain, many forget that months prior to the media showing up, the camp was run by a few dedicated individuals with research and who were willing to take a stand. Yet as one look at Burnaby Mountain, which seems at surface value is a huge victory by the people, there were some deeper themes that brought up. The courts dropped the charges at the exact same time as Kinder Morgan was done their drilling. And although the symbolic arrest gathered wide attention, they failed to stop work. And so as a friend wrote to me during that time, the lines get really blurry when the end game of civil disobedience is getting arrested, rather than the goal being not getting arrested and stopping a pipeline. And so, yet, in my own experience, the ugliest thing to rear its head at Burnaby was the racism inherent in our institutions. In jail, I witnessed discrimination firsthand of my First Nations friends. Whether it was my Kwakwaka'wakw friend Dan, who was withheld a blanket and food in his cell, as the officer told him blankets and food are a privilege. Not only that, Sotla, a Squamish elder, was being refused to be handed her medicine, her heart medicine, in jail. I was released that night while they were kept in jail overnight until the next day. And while I recounted these stories of racism in the media scrum the following day, they were edited out by every media company before being published online. How does one find climate justice when the search for a sustainable atmosphere lives alongside so many other forms of injustice? Or perhaps we're missing the link that the injustices of racism, colonialism, and capitalism is what allows for the destruction of this planet and runaway climate change. That racism allows there to be climate refugees of color in the global south or indigenous communities downstream of the tar sand that cite over 20,000 treaty violations, yet neither of these groups are being heard. That the colonial process is at the very heart of taking away from communities that have been here the longest the ability to say no. Whether it was no to settlement, no to having their kids taken away, and now no to pipelines. That pipelines perhaps are merely just another capitalist project that sees the world as commodities rather than living species and ecosystems that we relate to and have friendships to. And are these not the roots of all these pipelines? And if so, then how do we support each other's struggles? And as we were debriefing from lessons learned from Burnaby, tossing ideas around, we quickly found out that Kinder Morgan executives were having a dinner at a sustainable seafood restaurant. So we just found out that Kinder Morgan executives are renting out Fishworks. It's an Oceanwise restaurant, and we're going to go disrupt it. And we've got pictures here to show what fossil fuel extraction is already creating within this nation.
Go. Here we go. Straight in, guys. Straight in.
This is it. Open the door.
Because it's the lives of our kids. We're talking about water here. That's life. If you got no water, there's no life. You got no food. How are they going to live? You know, after they take all the oil out of this place, what is it going to be? What is it going to look like? And what our kids are going to live on? The oil companies have ruined everything for us. You're right. Their almighty dollar comes first. You know, that's pretty sad. You can't drink oil to live.
My country is being tested by this hailstorm called Super Typhoon Haiyan. Haiyan left a wake of massive destruction that is unprecedented, unthinkable, and horrific. And the devastation is staggering. I struggle to find words even for the images that we see on the news coverage. And I struggle to find words to describe how I feel about the losses. I speak for my delegation, but I speak for the countless people who will no longer be able to speak for themselves after perishing from the storm. I speak also for those who have been orphaned by the storm. I speak for those we can take drastic action now to ensure that we prevent a future where super typhoons become a way of life.
You know, my partner told me after the action that one of the Kinder Morgan workers told her, "You should have ISIS or terrorists on your face instead of climate justice." Since when did taking a stand for clean water and fresh air against a multi-million-dollar company become akin to terrorism? After the action, we had articles written about us explaining that we were radicals and extremists. And, you know, don't get me wrong, I'm pretty used to those two words growing up as a snowboarder. But, I mean, to say that poisoning huge amounts of water while elevating cancer risks downstream of the tar sands is radical. building more fossil fuel infrastructure in the midst of climate change is extremely radical. Standing up and taking action for frontline communities is certainly not. Yet, individual actions alone, such as the Kinder Morgan action, do not necessarily bring social change or spark a movement. Rosa Parks is a prime example of this. She was one of hundreds before her who started the bus sit-ins. She just so happened to be the first one that was remembered and that sparked interest in the general public. Actions themselves can seem invisible at the time, yet it's when we take them time and time again that those in power notice, when resistance becomes a lifestyle. And lucky for us, there are people and groups creating this space within our province already. In addition to filming the last couple of Klabana Keepers blockades, we've also filmed some shorts for the Unistoten camp that is located just outside of Houston, BC. An hour down an old dusty logging road with our old school bus called Boris, and you get to the bridge at the Unistoten. And not before crossing, because you have to go through FPIC, free, prior, informed consent. When you're asked not only where you're from and what you're doing, but how your stay will benefit the Unistoten people. And once we were let in and walked beside the recently built bunkhouse, we were told about the history of the camp and an off-grid solar-powered log cabin before heading to a permaculture garden where the little tiny bit of soil that's left from surviving the years of clear-cut logging in the territory is making a miraculous return and feeding the entire camp. And as we spent time in the newly constructed pit house, Frida, the spokesperson, told me of plans of building a healing center for youth this upcoming summer. You'd think this place I was talking about was a utopic community, more so than a resistance camp. But it just so happens that not only is the off-grid house on the route of the proposed Enbridge pipeline, but the proposed Pacific Trails and Coastal GasLink frack gas pipelines run through the pit house and the permaculture garden. Their stance is clear and no nonsense. There will be no pipelines on Unistoten land. You know, this camp made me realize that resistance is as much a lifestyle as it is any individual action. That not only does the Unistoten camp stand as a blockade, but it also stands as a place of healing, not only the soul, but of humans, of healing, of connecting with nature again, of breaking the legacy of colonization. It's a camp that's resurrecting natural laws, such as only taking what you need and respecting each other, and customs that have allowed their people to live off these lands for time immemorial. You know, this camp is set up not just for Native people, it's for Native and non-Native alike. What this group is doing is inspirational, yet it has been branded in a recently leaked document as being militant and a threat to the Canadian economy by industry, the government, and the RCMP. While camps like the Unistoten have been under surveillance from our government, the Klabana Keepers up north were handed down an injunction this past fall while we were there during a blockade to kick them off their traditional territories and prevent them from blocking Imperial Metals, the company responsible for Mount Poly. Injunctions allow business to continue as usual while bypassing any debate on land claims and sovereignty. So how does one change anything when one does not have a right to? When the Haida chief stood up and protected South Moresby, they didn't have a right to. Martin Luther King didn't have a right to march on Selma for equal voting rights. And neither did the Klabana Keepers when they kicked Shell out of the sacred headwaters, yet all these groups had a deep-seated sense of responsibility. And unlike rights that are handed down by the state to us, responsibilities come from within each of us and empower us and can guide our actions. Responsibilities that we all have is to the air our kids will need to breathe, to the water our kids may want to drink in northeastern BC, and to the animals and ecosystems that are collapsing across this planet that our kids and us youth have every right to see. You know, climate change creates an existential crisis, but in every existential crisis, there is an opportunity. And my time spent along these inspiring activists has not only taught me about the importance of civil disobedience, of responsibilities, of natural laws, but also opened my mind to an entirely different way of seeing the world. I want to bring us back to that first action we took up Clapan and the drill rigs in the summer of 2013. And, in all honesty, being in a blockade is pretty nerve-wracking. We're snowboarders, remember? Or this isn't what we normally do in the summertime. And I was nervous, and then one of the elders could tell I was nervous, and he came into the bus, and his name is Nasata. And he told me something that I'll never forget. And he said, "Boy, don't be nervous. You're not Canadian. You've been here 6.5 weeks, drinking from the rivers here. And if biology has taught us anything, it's that we're made up to 70% water. Therefore, more than anything you've ever been told, more than flesh and bones, you are the water, you are the Clapan River, you are sacred, and no one can ever take that away from you." This goes past the tactics of activism or how to create a different world to a fundamentally different way of seeing ourselves as human beings. That to be Clabanatine does not end at your fingertips, but it is to be the mountains, the rivers, the animals, or the sacred headwaters. This changes everything, because underneath his statement is the reality that human beings are not innately destructive or blind consumers, but meant to contribute to something much bigger than ourselves. This is the type of headspace that allows us to fundamentally fight what seems like overwhelming odds. Because this push for extractive projects like pipelines, coal mines, coal trains, mines, LNG, seems to come with monumentous power structures behind it. One can get lost. How does one find a path? The answer is in as much our minds as it is in our tactics. It lies within our conscious awareness of individual responsibility that we all have and our readiness to act. That when we can foster an ethics of equality, of being nature, then we will build communities that we know in our hearts as possible, and they will no doubt be communities of resistance. Communities that choose to fight for life rather than fight for the corporate model of greed and growth. And if we're going to fight for life, then what better model than that of wild salmon, whose responsibility to its children have it swimming against currents, raging rivers, jumping off giant cliffs, and against all odds, succeeding, while all the while feeding everything around it, the bears, the wolves, the humans, the soil, the animals. They're an animal, a species, no different than us, acting out their responsibility to their future children and their kin, while giving back to every other living being on this land that we can collectively call home. Thank you.
Wow. I'm speechless. Two incredibly inspiring young people. I can't resist. I just want to add one quick thing to make people aware before we dive into the discussion. And that is 2 weeks ago, we had giving the lecture here John Burroughs, First Nation scholar of constitutional law. And his lecture is beautiful. I would encourage people to watch it. And the one little thing that feeds into what we just heard, and we heard from both of you, is the land that we're on and who was here taking care of that land before most of us arrived, historically speaking, and that there were laws here. And when we talk about who's blockading what, where, flipping around, you're talking about how we think about these things, flipping around, who has the rights and who has the responsibilities and who is violating whose laws. When you talk about the sacred headwaters, it really flips how you think things around. Anyway, sorry for the digression. These two are awesome. Can we have one more round of applause and then we'll have questions? Questions or comments?
I noticed some Kinder Morgan Fishworks activists out in the crowd.
She's looking around. Yeah.
Do you want to mute it or?
That's trying to make it work.
Thank you for your justice-friendly talk. My question is about the raging grannies. I love raging grannies. I think you are the raging grandchildren. And I think I was wondering, how can you bring the two together? Because I think police also love putting handcuffs on raging grannies. And I think there has been a lot of history of raging grannies which people don't know, that they have also been involved with civil disobedience. I think they did a lot of protests against nuclear armaments and so on. And I think their history is not known. Unfortunately, we are a very age-segregated society, and we remember Martin Luther King, but we don't remember our neighbors. So I wonder, any suggestions about bringing the raging grannies, and why not use the terms like raging grannies and raging grandchildren? Because I often, Lynn said about, I grew up in Africa, and we had the slogan, either you go work for justice or you go to jail. And since jail, there was no money to build jails, we ended up working for independence or anti-colonial struggles, which of course now has become class struggles. But I think I like to use the term justice-friendly as much. I call myself justice-friendly pacifist.
Yeah, I think that's something I definitely took away from our time in the Sacred Headwaters, and not only there, but at the Unistoten as well, where you have resistance camps that are actually led by their elders, and that's a cultural trait of some of those communities. And I think you just think about that quote from the elder and how much that calmed me down and allowed me to take that action, and I think we forget about how valuable our elders are. They're libraries of knowledge, of resistance, of experiences, and I think that actually happened at Burnaby too. I remember there was one night we were there by the fire, and two of the people that were there were asking, like, it just really feels like we need guidance right now. And that following day is when the Squamish elder Sutlot actually arrived at the camp the next day, and pretty much stayed there ever since. And so I think it's so key to our struggle, because youth can have the energy, but they can sometimes not always think things through, or have the experience to know what's not going to work. And I think that that's our responsibility as youth too, to respect that.
Hi. It's nice to see people, young people, some 50 years after our experience of the Simon Fraser 114. I was a veteran of the 114. Our goal at the time was trying to bring justice within the educational sphere, allowing students from the community colleges in interiors to have equal footing with in terms of academic standing, equal footing with our students here in the big cities. We were arrested, 114. I was almost arrested again at that time after you people. I was supposed to be arrested on Sunday, but they withdrew, but they declared the whole thing was on Thursday, so I didn't show up. Okay. I come here is not to talk about reminiscing our past glories. Simon Fraser today, my alma mater, now is a part of the academia that having seemingly a kind of peace within the academic world. But we know that injustice, the kind of hierarchy exists, and that battle is not won yet. But I'm come here specifically want to learn. Yes, we are having a federal election this fall. What are you going to do? What do you think that you could do in combining the action of the ecological, environmental work, climate change, clean water, clean air, food sustainability, with that we want to, as Brigette, you said that, stop Hopper in the Senate. How can we stop that now? Because power is most important. the corporations, the government, they know they have the power. They may tolerate you as they tolerate us at that time, even though that we pay the price for it, but they tolerate it because they could still continue with their kind of politics of domination, politics of exploitation, politics of segregation. Totally ignoring you. They could sideline the people, allowing you to survive, but not to change their work. So what we have to do is that what we need to do, we have to revisit the English Civil War that brought the crown, the monarchy down. We have to take back the power of government from the hands of those of the corporates and their political friends of her. So I will ask you, what are we going to do?
Maybe that's a Brigette question in some ways. What's the strategy? Since that's what you're doing right now, Brigette.
Yeah, that's a really important question, and thank you for bringing that.
Transfer.
Does that work?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that question, and also for the work that you've done, the risks that you took. There's so much to learn from that. I think we are at a critical turning point, especially seeing the Harper government really going in the direction of the oil and gas industry, putting all of our eggs in one basket at the expense that we've seen the human lives. So what do we do? One thing that I think can be really powerful is getting out the vote. And for a long time, I was very skeptical about this as a strategy and the political system. When I was working in the parliament, a few months even before that, someone asked me if I'd go canvassing, and I said no, I don't believe in that. And political system is fundamentally corrupt. At the same time, having seen 4 years of what the Harper government is capable of, seeing that it's really critical that we see a shift in government if we want progress on any of these issues. And it needs to be with a strategy of nonviolent direct action as well to push whatever leaders are going to be in power to transition towards renewable energies. We are doing a Get Out the Youth Vote campaign where we're organizing in different communities where there was a small margin of victory, one of which, Burnaby South, really close to here, very small margin. And, there's some great candidates to support. We see how we can really make a difference in some of these ridings where there was such a small margin. And it can be a matter of, a few classrooms voting that can literally make the difference. It's incredible. And so I think it's really important that we mobilize. If you are interested at all, please sign on that sheet, volunteer on getting out the vote. It will take a snowflake model, so that's where you have 5 people trained, and then they train 5 other people, and they train 5 other people. It will take an enormous amount of people power because we've learned that the best way to mobilize people to vote is through person-to-person contact. So that's through our families, our communities. If you go to canadians.org/IWillVote, you can pledge to vote, and you can also talk with your friends and your family to encourage them to pledge to vote or to volunteer with us. The other big thing here is that the Conservative government, they don't want us to vote. With the Fair Elections Act, we're seeing intense voter suppression. We're talking about thousands of cases of voter suppression mixed with robocalls. That's with the Fair Elections Act. So the Council of Canadians and the Canadian Federation of Students, we've launched a legal challenge against this to say, it's not fair that you're making it harder for students to vote, as well as Indigenous people and other minorities, homeless people. And why don't they want us to vote, right? They don't want us to vote, and that's one of the reasons why we need to go out and mobilize the vote.
Tamo, did you have anything to add to?
Yeah, we're going to be, in our little snowboard fashion, we'll be doing a Get the Outdoor Community Out to Vote. And it's basically some of the ideas that are popping up is just events within the key areas, strategic ridings where resorts and outdoor snowboard kind of communities are. And we'll be having kind of like a little music events, but also election parties and such like that. But I think hers is the big one, and I'm stoked it's big. I mean, at the end of the day, the Harper government is going to come down a lot differently than other parties on the camps I before mentioned. And I think, but at the same time, we cannot risk, I wouldn't say so much putting all our eggs in one basket, but allowing ourselves to burn out in one election. How do we use campaigning of the election to build connections, to build community, that whatever happens at this election, we're going to be stronger the day after whoever gets in power?
Hi. Thank you both for coming. I've got a question, basically just curious on your opinions on this, because it's something that I myself have been wondering and haven't come to an answer yet, but just wondering if you have opinions on, say, the role of social media in getting people active. So, as I've been thinking about this, on the one hand, it seems a great tool for spreading word and getting people informed and garnering at least emotional support. On the other hand, I fear it might be a way of sort of pacifying people or letting them feel like they've done something by, clicking like or sharing without actually getting out into the streets. So I'm wondering, do you think this is a tool we can use? Is it a tool we're using yet or using well? Or do you have any thoughts on this? Either one of you, or both.
Okay. Yeah, I think that social media is a really important tool. Like we saw, for example, with the revolution in Egypt, it was critical in building the mobilization, that overthrew dictator. I think that we also saw how powerful it was at Burnaby Mountain. It was amazing. Burnaby Mountain updates, I don't know, thousands of people liked that, and that was the main source, or one of the main sources of information for calling for people to come to the mountain, especially when mainstream media wasn't necessarily covering it at some of the beginning stages of that. So it was a really critical way for us to communicate with one another. So in that way, I think that social media is really powerful as one part of the strategy and as one tool. It's like you need, your bike wrench, but you also need other tools to make your bike work, So I think similarly with Shit Harper did, I was briefly working with them, which was a really awesome experience, and they have done some great work around education and so that young people can understand what the implications of the Harper government are. So I think pairing that kind of social media and education and awareness building with on-the-ground mobilizing and the face-to-face getting out the vote is going to be critical for the election as well.
Totally, I agree with that. Yeah, I think, like I said, I think it's one part of it. It's a tool, and the other side uses that tool, and it's important for us too, but it as we're seeing in other countries, it can be blocked off. So how do we prepare? I mean, that was happening in the protests for democracy in Hong Kong. And so how do we prepare to communicate without social media, with our close networks? And that happened up at Clapan when we were at our blockades. Is the day that the police came up to the actual drill rigs, they shut off all our radios and our Wi-Fi. And so just being prepared for that. And we were talking to one of the guys who was, they were running the Sea Shepherd live feed up at Burnaby Mountain, and they were saying they constantly had to use new phones just because they were cutting it off right at the time where they were arresting people. And yeah, so just understanding that it's like a tool that the other side knows exists. Yeah. Yeah.
Then we can't use it against you later.
Okay. Great, they'll use this against me next time I apply for a visa. Thanks for both your talks. One of the questions I had is, it's sort of dovetailing with the question that you asked earlier. So there's an election coming up, and what you've both identified is how broken the system is. At the same time, we need immediate change, and we believe that that'll happen through a provincial and national election, right? Okay, so What I'm asking is based on what Harsha Walia said in her talk a few months ago here. How do we move for that immediate, we have to change the government now, without creating or helping to create subjects who believe that the way we're going to get justice is through the state structure, which has only shown imperial, colonial, patriarchal, white supremacist, like list all of the terrible things about it. And so we have to vote, but at the same time we recognize the system is busted. So how do we change through the system without creating people who put their faith in the system? Because I think if we want any kind of actual equality, it has to be found outside of that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say a huge part of that is educating while we're working within those structures of getting people out to vote, or whether we're working outside of those structures, right? Is educating on the role of the state and the history of the state of Canada, right? Like you said, this basically the state was created on the backs of Indigenous people, on the theft of their land. And if we don't understand the role of state, then we're not going to understand where the state is going to go. And I think while we get people out to the vote, while we use these political systems, because they are all over us, you know, they control so much of us, we have to at the same time educate about what the state has done so far and what it could do in the future. But I think it's a tricky question.
It's a really good point, and I really respect Harsha and her work, and I think it's a really important question to consider how we can create consciousness around the need for systemic change while also being strategic in these immediate things. I think part of it is like being real about what we can realistically change with a new government in power. So, you know, that will realistically change things like we may see restoration of healthcare for refugees. We may see, the rejection of certain pipelines by the state. At the same time, there are a lot of things we won't see, even with a change in government. You know, none of the current political parties have come out against certain pipelines. I don't know their stance on something like what's happening with the Kelowna Keepers.
Yeah.
We won't see change on that necessarily unless we push any government.
For sure. I guess like when I speak honestly, it's hard to see. I think it's important to work on things because they control so much of our lives, but at the same time, nation states uphold capitalism, and they always will, and capitalism depends on infinite resources on a finite planet. And so how do we start building the grounds of a system without nation states?
I was going to jump in on this one, but you ended it so well. I had to have a hard time, but I'm going to jump in anyway. Because obviously I agonized a lot over, there's not a soul in the room that doesn't know I'm running for Parliament, so I just, I agonized a lot over it because I share everything that I've heard in this room. And I'm, as a scientist, I'm essential in my essential being, I'm pragmatic. And so I look at how do we get from here to there? And I spent a lot of time thinking about the various paths that might get there. And I think, honestly, I really, all that I came up with is that I don't know, but also that it's everything. And so although I'm leaving the front line and kind of going into the belly of the beast, I'm doing that in full recognition that we need the front line. We need activism, and I want to be there too, but it feels that, we need both. We need all of the above, and so we do need to do the things that you said, and I'm actually even slightly more optimistic than you are, but if I start saying why, then it'll be a political speech.
I think something too to add to that is like during the South Moresby campaign in Haida Gwaii, one of the federal MPs at the time was giving insider information to the Haida about what was happening with, I believe it was McMillan Bodell, I'm not sure, but just shows that like we need people in every position right now.
Well, even on Burnaby Mountain, we had Kennedy Stewart dropping by with inside information at times too, and he was incredibly supportive. So you're right.
Totally.
And in large part, what put these pieces together, what we're talking about right now, and we're talking about what's sometimes called a dual power structure, when we need to work the system as it exists, however broken it is. But there's still some levers we can yank, and they creak and grind and don't work completely, but we need to yank them because we're in an emergency situation. At the same time, we have to do what Tamo is saying too, which is building that new system, a new way of relating to each other on the planet that completely replaces what's going on here.
Hey, I'm interested in the questions that have been coming up from the audience and from you guys as well, about how we start to build in between sort of reaction points. We have moments like the moment on Burnaby Mountain, or even just for individuals, moments like where you went up to the Klabona Keepers, and there's something very big or very visible that happens for a moment, like the election, for example. And then in between those times, we've all been saying we need more connections between age groups, more connections between the Council of Canadians and the students at SFU. We need more thinking in advance before something's happening. I'm wondering, I'm not in on those conversations, but maybe you guys are. What groups are talking about that kind of how to bridge more between crises and between groups? That's a really broad question, but I'm just wondering what you're seeing in between, and maybe how those of us who aren't in a group can get more involved. If it could just be join a group, but I'm wondering.
Yeah, that's an awesome question. I think I alluded to that in my speech, in that resistance is almost a lifestyle. And with the issues we face, it's not just a pipeline. It's not Kinder Morgan. Like we're facing some big structural issues here: capitalism, racism. And so, how do we do that in our everyday lives? And it actually doesn't. It's not just about standing up. It's about changing our personal relationships with each other. How do we erase these oppressive systems that are inherent in our system and taught to us while we grow up? And how do we get rid of those face to face while we build community? While we educate children, while we stop pipelines. And I think it's as much a process as anything. And I think by doing that, by opening ourselves to new ideas, opening ourselves to struggles that we don't even know about yet, right, that other people are working on, that's how those bridges will be filled in. That's how we'll meet each other. And it's been really neat right now. I just got back up from Iskut, actually, the Tahltan territory, yesterday. And there's no resistance going on right now. It's winter time, and we're working with the youth 5 days a week, taking them out onto their traditional territory with a student empowerment program, and taking them out onto the territory and then bringing them back to their elders so they can realize why their elders are standing up. But it's also given us exposure to a lot of the community that we didn't meet in the resistance camps, because they gave us exposure to the people in the community that work in the mines, the families. And that's where we're not per se in that action mode, but we're building those connections who are living a very different struggle, a financial struggle, that has to be addressed at the same time as the environmental struggle.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Yeah, I agree with that, and I think that when we are talking about, how can we connect with one another, especially across generations, I do see a lot of that work happening with a lot of grassroots groups like Broke, Rising Tide Collective, other collectives that are here, and I think, there's always a way to get involved. If you're interested in, say, getting involved in council, definitely, sign up. I don't know if there's a way to get involved with Beyond Boarding, and also if you're interested in getting involved, I'd love to talk afterwards. And then, beyond the groups, I think, yes, similar to what Tamo said, it's a lifestyle, it's the podcasts you listen to and the books you're reading or what you're watching and your friends. If it's, dinner table conversation, that sort of thing.
I think one of the answers to that, too, is everybody wants that. Every group I know of are exactly saying, how do we have that conversation so that we're bridging with other groups? So there's the struggle is, how do you actually do that work between, everyone's desirous of it. Everyone realizes how, there was a question here and then we'll come back over there.
Thank you for your talks. Really liked your reference to the salmon swimming upstream. That was a great reference, I think. My question is, right now with the global oil prices, I think the timing of it couldn't be better to kind of leverage that against the Harper government, because essentially all the promises they're making are right now being undermined. And the fact is, you can't just ignore it, because the thing is, we are not in control. The thing is, what happens with investors globally highly affects our economy, and right now we're seeing it. And we're pumping out oil from the tar sands, extracting it. But they're doing it simply because they have the infrastructure. And just, it seems completely almost insane to keep building more infrastructure, considering the implications we're already seeing right now, how basically it's volatile. And I was just wondering if there's anything happening right now that, if you're using this timing to kind of to try to stop the tar sands.
I think you got to kick them while they're down.
I guess just, can we take maybe 2 comments at once or questions at once? Then you guys can, because we're running out of time rapidly too. So go ahead.
It's okay. I just had something to add to what you asked about getting more involved, because for me, it was really an individual action that I started. I literally just let curiosity take over. I was in first year college, and my entire life, I avoided the topics of politics and economics. So I decided to challenge that, and I chose that topic for a project, and I chose the topic of Indigenous revolution. And that led me to so many other places, including Burnaby Mountain, which was my first action. So I think the first step really is the self. And Glenn Coulthard, he used a metaphor that described it like amazingly. He used the metaphor, the war on 2 fronts, to describe transformation. One front representing the individual and the collective, and the other front representing the structural and the systemic. And a lot of times we focus on the structural and systemic and ignore the individual, the very first and crucial step, which is self-transformation, self-affirmation, self-recognition. That's the crucial first step that will take you there. And we obviously can't change other people, but we can start with ourselves, and it really gives a big influence on others, especially younger people. That's how they start to rise up, and that's how I started to rise up. So I think that metaphor could kind of help you see where you can go.
And we, of course, saw you rising up in one of those videos. Go ahead, Toby, let's have a comment.
Yeah, Valine inspires me every time she speaks. About that question, one really good thing to watch right now is Naomi Klein's call out about that on The Guardian right now. She released a video, and it's called Kick 'em While They're Down. And it's basically saying we have a huge opportunity because, the economy is going to recover and oil prices are going to go up. But right now we have the opportunity to lift those subsidies on oil right now and shift them away and put them on renewables. So yeah, right now is go time. But we're not going to get that from the Harper government. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think similarly, there's a really good article as well in the Toronto Star that talks about how these oil prices is an opportunity to shift away from an economy that is way too dependent on oil, and that it allows for the Harper government, it won't have the same revenues that it promised, and it also allows for us to kind of see how the Harper government is failing on the economy, like with rising youth unemployment, like with record high tuition fees. So I think it's a really important opportunity, as you say, to shift to renewables. And I just want to thank you so much for sharing your wisdom and your story. It's really inspiring.
I think it's a real threat to and we all know that, to predicate our economy on one thing, because it becomes so volatile to the different market changes and prices. And the economy, when we originally created it, was to serve us, but now everyone is serving the economy. So how do we change that, right?
I think we are out of time, I'm afraid. And so I want everyone to join us in thanking Tamo and Brigette. Part of my mind thinks, okay, so how are we going to do this? And we're not all Brigette and Tamo. But I think that you're doing primary work by the communicative kind of work you're doing that spreads that virus you have to other people. So I thank you for continuing to spread this virus you have far and wide. Thanks so much for being here and speaking to us. And please, everyone, join us in thanking Brigette and Tamo.